So, hello, welcome to Humanities Montana's latest Montana Conversation. We are very pleased to have Ellen Baumler with us today. Ellen was the interpretive historian at the Montana Historical Society from 1992 until 2018. And we are so pleased that she can be here with us today to tell us some untold stories of Montana history. And with that, I'll let you take it, Ellen.
Thank you, Sam. So I'd like to address the question, whose stories are left untold, and sort of explore the idea of why that might be. I'm going to focus this program on the Chinese laborers who came to the West and to Montana by the hundreds in the 19th century. Their story really never does make it to the history books beyond a sentence or two. And it is kind of a story that's shrouded in mystery. And so we'll sort of explore the reasons for that. There are actually two parallel histories of the Chinese in Montana and in the West. The first group is a small group of professional folks who came sometimes with their families to settle and to really support this other larger group. The story of these professional folks, the story of the Chin family, is beautifully told in Butte at the Meiwa Museum. And if you've never visited there, I really recommend that you go. It tells the story of these professional Chinese folks really in a wonderful way. But the other group, this much larger group, it was a very odd population because it was exclusively male. These Chinese have a history really that is very little known, I think. And they did make up 10% of Montana's territorial population in 1870. They made up Montana's largest ethnic group. And weirdly enough, people want to know what happened to them. And by the 1950s, really very few remained here. Their homes and businesses fell victim to urban renewal programs. Time erased the remote mining and railroad camps. Traces of their culture truly did disappear. And so their stories sort of grew into myth and legend. Yet it was this particular group that helped develop Montana's natural resources. And as the placer mining played out, 15,000 to 17,000 Chinese workers helped lay the tracks of the Northern Pacific across Montana and across the Northwest. So where did they come from and why were they here? So you can see this map of China. At the very bottom is a province called Guangdong, or we know it as Canton. And this is where most of the overseas Chinese came from. But even more specifically than that, they came from this little district called Toisan. And the reason that they came, this was terrible times in China. There was a rebellion called the Taiping Rebellion that was going on in China, and its years spanned 1850 to 1864, which corresponds almost exactly with the gold rushes here in the West, and not only here in the United States, but also in Australia and New Zealand. And so people from Toisan came to all of those places to follow the gold rush initially. They came because there was this Taiping Rebellion going on. They estimate between 30 and 70 million people died during this rebellion. And it was a time of overpopulation, it was a time of famine, and people were really desperate to feed their families. So the gold rush offered this great opportunity for people to leave their families and temporarily follow the gold rush like a lot of other people did as well. But sometimes these folks couldn't afford to get back. Sometimes they did go back to China, and sometimes they remained here and died here. If you look at the population in 1890 in Montana, there were more than 2,500 Chinese here at that time, and there were only 59 women among those. And so we can see how uneven this population was. I mean, it was a really bizarre population. So they were temporary. The language that they spoke, Toisanese, is a dialect of Cantonese. Today, the national language is Mandarin. If you study Chinese, you study Mandarin Chinese. They're not the same language. So the documents that we may have extant are oftentimes written in Toisanese. That's a dead language. And when you translate Toisanese into Mandarin, it's not the same. And so we really can't even trust the documents we have that have been translated. So this resulted in really severe discrimination. The fact that they were temporary, the fact that there were so many Chinese, and the fact that they really were sort of kept apart because of their language difficulties and their culture. This poster shows the severe discrimination. This is just one example of many, many that we could look at. But this is a poster that blames the Chinese for epidemics. Anything bad that happened in a community, whether it was fire or epidemics or whatever, Chinese were almost always blamed if there was a Chinese population there. And this shows the three specters of the most feared diseases: smallpox, leprosy, and malaria, emanating from Chinatown in San Francisco. And again, this is just one little tiny example, but I think it's a good example. So partly because of the isolation of this particular ethnic group and their sheer numbers, they endured very harsh treatment, and that extended to laws. There were laws passed in Montana specific to the Chinese, and there were federal laws also. Probably the most famous one is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which came just on the cusp of the completion of the Northern Pacific. That was completed in 1883, and this law was passed in 1882. And it is the first federal law targeting a specific ethnic group. And it said that no skilled or unskilled laborers from China could come into the United States. And that, you know, is kind of interesting too, because once the Northern Pacific was completed and the Great Northern was built and the lines needed refurbishing and maintenance, it were the Japanese that were imported to do that work. And that's why you find a lot of Japanese folks living in various communities in the early 1900s. So what we know about the Chinese really, we only know through what they left behind. And there are a few good examples. This slide shows what is often called a Chinese oven. These are found along the railroad grade in the Northwest. And what they really are Italian bread ovens. They were built by Italian railroad workers who couldn't live without their bread. When they were stable in a couple of weeks, they would always build these bread ovens. Nothing to do with the Chinese. The other really big myth is Chinese tunnels. And almost every community has a story about Chinese tunnels, but it's a concept that communities have such a hard time letting go of. Chinese tunnels are a myth, a complete and total myth. Tunnels leave no cultural footprint. And Priscilla Weggers, who is the foremost authority in Asian migration in the United States at the University of Idaho, has a wonderful website that you could look at. And she talks about Chinese tunnels. She spent much of her career looking for them and never found a single one. So we have a lot of tunnels that run under our urban areas that delivered steam heat. We have mining tunnels that do run under some neighborhoods that were heavily mined. A lot of people dug tunnels, including the Chinese, but probably everybody used them and not necessarily just one ethnic group. And then we have some artifacts that have been really misidentified. This is a fairly common one. This is called a wine jug sometimes, but it's actually a soy pot that doesn't have a handle. And so these are pretty common in Montana. And the other thing that is very common in archaeological sites is these little tiny bottles that are often labeled opium bottles. They were not opium bottles. They never held liquid. They were one-dose mineral cures, and they were Chinese. The sides are flat here. But the Chinese didn't generally use liquid opium. They smoked it, and it came in gum form, not in liquid. Liquid form is laudanum, which you could buy at the pharmacy and had nothing to do really with the Chinese. So these are very, very common. You find them in antique stores too. So finally, let's see, we have one individual story about a Chinese railroad worker. And this beautiful embroidered pouch came from Missoula. It's now in the Montana Historical Society's museum collection. And the unusual thing about it is that it came with its contents intact. And there you can see on the slide the various things that were in this pouch. At the bottom on the left, there is a comb, Chinese coins, and at the top there is a beautiful brass and leather flint case. You open it up and there's a steel spine that you would use to strike a flint, and that would start a fire if you're camping out or if you're traveling on the countryside, a really essential piece of equipment. And on the other side, you have a letter that was also preserved in this pouch. And the letter, if it's been translated correctly, and I can't vouch for that, but it is dated 1893, and we know that it is to a man named Ah Hei, and he supposedly was a railroad worker who remained in Montana. And his writing to him, and the gist of the letter is, he says, "We don't care about fortune, we don't care about the money, just make enough so that you can buy a ticket to come home so that mother doesn't have to worry about you anymore." So the sad thing is that because this beautifully embroidered pouch ended up with its contents intact in someone else's hands, probably means that Ahei never made it home, which is a fairly typical story, really. And so finally, we really hear seldom about the contributions of the Chinese to Montana. And a really good example of that is at the head of the Grand Staircase in Montana State Capitol, the painting that signifies the driving of the Golden Spike, the meeting of the East and West of the Northern Pacific across Montana, really typifies that. And if you look at that painting, you'll see that you have Ulysses S. Grant holding the mallet, you have Native Americans over whose land the tracks crossed, and you have a worker there in the foreground and others in the back with their hats held high, but there's not a single Chinese there. The thing that's really rather poignant is that the only reminder of the Chinese contribution to the building of the railroad is in the Northern Pacific emblem, which is the yin yang. So a lack of understanding, I think, is the real story here. We had a language barrier, we had a lack of permanent intention, we had very harsh treatment by many people on all levels, from the federal government to local communities. And that really led to myth and legend and misinterpretation. So we might ask if separatism, this lack of intent to stay, is a fault. Many people came for the gold rush, and not all of them intended to stay, and many of them didn't. So I think that is a question that really does merit further discussion. And so I'd just like to leave you with this thought today, and that is, can you think of other groups or other individuals that fit this same pattern whose stories have been untold?
Thank you, Ellen. That's a really intriguing question. And I want to know, how do we find out what these stories are?
Well, I think, through interviewing people, through looking for those stories. I mean, a lot of the times we don't know the stories because we just haven't done the research. And that's certainly true of African Americans. They have very rich stories, but we haven't looked for them very hard. And so I think a lot of the time, that's what it takes. It takes research. It takes looking for those stories.
The stories that we value and the stories that we ask for are the ones that we hear.
Exactly right.
By talking to you about this program and by doing some research on our own and starting to show that we care about these stories, maybe we can uncover some of these.
Hopefully so. There are so many stories that have been left untold. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, and
thank you.
See you next time.
All right.